Have to, Rafe, I think, prepare ourselves for what I think are quite a small minority, but quite vocal. And I don't just mean those that are Republicans in the sense that they believe in a republic with a president and not a monarchy. I mean, Tony Benn was one of those, and I remember discussing this very subject with him. And he said, you know, just because I'm not a monarchist doesn't mean I'm not a patriot. And Ben used to make that point very strongly. And there are arguments around, there always have been. I mean, gosh, I remember at school debating whether we should be a republic or a monarchy. So these debates have gone on, and they will always go on. But there's a new, how can I put this, dimension to all of this. And this is a kind of a new form of hatred that wants us to despise ourselves, despise our country, despise our history. And if that's your agenda, well, you have to despise the monarchy, because otherwise the other parts don't work. And this is the charge, of course, that is made of colonialism, of us having an appalling history. And I think we can expect more of that, don't you?
Well, in the Twitter sphere, which we always try to avoid and ignore, there have been a few elements of that. What I've been quite impressed by is how you actually haven't had much of that yet. But yes, undoubtedly, things have changed in recent years, and it's quite frustrating for those of us who actually know history, because the monarchy have been really examples of tolerance for so many generations. King George III wrote an essay opposing slavery and condemning slavery. You know, King Edward VII was so opposed to and horrified by anti-Semitism that he refused to engage with many members in Parliament over it. And it was also the fact that, you know, if you look at Queen Victoria, she famously had a very warm relationship with one of her Muslim servants and attendants, as well as with Maharaja Dalip Singh. You know, the monarchy have been actually far more evolved than the generations around which they were living. And of course, we have to remember, it was the Queen's Royal Navy and the King's Royal Navy who actually enforced the abolition of the slave trade around the world. It was King George III who guaranteed the indigenous people of North America the right to have... Why is this not taught?
Why is none of this being taught in schools? Because, you know, people, they're taught about slavery. You would think from some of the commentary that we're the only country in the world that ever conducted slavery, forgetting the fact it goes back thousands of years, and that many people from Wales and Cornwall were taken by...
Barbary slaves. But there were as many slaves held in Africa by Africans as were transported over to North America.
Is that right?
That's absolutely right. People don't seem to realise that. And in fact, when the British were trying to enforce the abolition of the slave trade in Nigeria and Benin, they had to go and stop them from actually committing human sacrifice. So it was the British trying to stop Africans enslaving and sacrificing other people in Nigeria and Benin. And of course, it has to be remembered that slave ships never actually went inland. They were moored off the coast, and they were purchasing slaves that had been captured during wars and so forth by other African tribes. And yet, for some reason, I don't ever see the BLM campaign protesting outside the Nigerian embassy, asking for reparations there, let alone the fact that the Islamic slave trade with African slaves carried on long after Britain abolished the slave trade, carried on into the 20th century. And Pakistan is now actually the global centre of modern slavery. And, you know, Sadiq Khan is forever telling us that he's the son of a Pakistani bus driver. He went to Pakistan, and on an official visit, and not once did he raise the issue of slavery there, whereas he wants to have a slavery museum in this country. And I would have thought the lives of people today are far more important than moaning about things that happened generations ago.
And yet, Rafe, if you went and said that at the Oxford Union, there'd be riots, wouldn't there?
Well, I'm going to the Cambridge Union on a very similar topic in a few months.
Well, we'll
see what happens.
You better
Maybe I can borrow a security guard.
I think you're going to... But this is the point, isn't it? That this attack on the royal family, this attack that they're symbols of colonialism. The New York Times even attacked the process of decolonisation. That somehow we mismanaged that as well. But actually, you know, the Queen has done more for people of colour around the world probably than any other human being, in her wish and desire for poor countries, struggling countries that were part of the Commonwealth to be helped, to be supported. And I made this point earlier, but I do not think in history there's ever been a country that had an empire that has finished up having very close and good relations with its former colonies. It doesn't work for Portugal, it doesn't work for Spain, it doesn't work for France, it absolutely doesn't work for Belgium, Germany, well, the less said the better. And you can go through the whole of Europe and find real enmities between former colonies and the former masters, and yet we now in the Commonwealth have countries applying to join and joining that were never even part of the British Empire. They think the club's that important. And I just repeat that point. You know, what is it in our education system that we're not teaching our kids balanced arguments about these things? What's gone wrong?
Well, the problem is, of course, the teacher training colleges. But lots of people think it's just the education system and the schools and universities, but it's actually the institutions that are churning out teachers. Back in the 1990s, you had 2 liberals for every conservative in the university setting. Now it's 8 or 9 to 1. That's just in the space of 30 years. In America, it's gone from 3 to 1 to 17 to 1. This has been a dramatic change, and so you actually can't really blame young children for becoming more and more woke when all that they get is this ideology that's attached to them. The old adage is, give me a boy to the age of 7 and I'll show you a man. Now we have it, give me a boy till he's 21 and graduated and I'll show you somebody who's entirely inculcated.
Well, and we should be teaching, I think, we should be teaching people that the Queen above all was a unifying figure. The Queen above all recognised different groups and identities in this country. She reached out to all of them in the most extraordinary, astonishing way. And I just worry that there'll be those that try to trash the legacy of the Queen.
I would say one of the Queen's greatest legacies, apart from keeping the Union together, was the ability to transition Britain from being an imperial power to a post-imperial power, and to do it so peacefully. When you compare it to what happened in France in the 60s, and then when they decolonised and all of the riots and war, the fact that we had a monarchy and the trappings of majesty made the transition very simple. And then to have the free association of peoples who became independent but yet came back together again.
It's a magnificent
achievement. It's a glorious story which we should celebrate.
I agree.